Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sabrina Kofer, and on behalf of Choice and Toward Inclusive Excellence, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Affirmative Action and the Future of DEI, a panel discussion. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to ask questions of our speakers and to share any comments. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. There is closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the CC button on the bottom panel of your screen. Last, please note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archive version. And now I'd like to hand it over to my colleague Fatima, who will talk more about Toward Inclusive Excellence and moderate today's panel discussion.
Hi, everyone. I'm Fatima Mohi Eldon. I'm the editor for TIE, and today's session is a part of Toward Inclusive Excellence, or what we call TIE for short, which is a content strand from Choice that explores issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion in and outside of the higher education community. We regularly publish blog posts, interviews, resource lists, and more. And if you would like to receive updates about the new content that we're posting, including blog posts, webinars like this, and resource lists, please use the links in the chat to sign up for our newsletter and to read the TIE blog. And if you're interested in contributing to TIE at all, please feel free to email me directly, and I'll drop my email in the chat as well. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. We're incredibly fortunate to be joined by Dr. Renata Chancellor, who is Associate Professor and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility at Syracuse University's School of Information Studies, as well as Dr. C. Sean Burns, who is Associate Professor at the University of Kentucky's School of Information Science, as well as President-elect of the Association for Library and Information Science Education, or ALISE. And lastly, we're fortunate as well to be joined by Dr. Jerome Offord Jr., who is the Associate University Librarian and Chief Diversity Officer for Harvard Library. So thank you all for being here, both our panelists and our attendees. And now we'll move toward the discussion. So to start, I wanted to sort of take a broad level overview of the issue at hand, affirmative action and the future of DEI. So as we all know, DEI programs and initiatives have been increasingly challenged and scrutinized for some years now, although attacks on DEI have exponentially increased since the start of 2025 because of the current administration's executive orders pertaining to illegal discrimination, DEI, and gender ideology. As a result, many higher education institutions are feeling pressured to restructure or even eliminate their DEI programs and offices, and some have even begun to do so. As indicated in the Chronicle of Higher Education's tracker of efforts to dismantle DEI initiatives and offices, and I'll drop that in that link in the chat shortly. So my question is, in this divisive and daunting moment, how can colleges and universities continue to advance their commitments to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And as hubs of institutional knowledge, how might academic libraries in particular position themselves to bolster this commitment? So I'll call on our panelists one at a time to answer. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Renata Chancellor, if you would like to share your thoughts with us.
Sure, and again, thank you for having me. It is a difficult time that a lot of universities are experiencing, so I think this is a great question. One of the things I think that we could do that can be done is for organizations like institutions and libraries should double down. I know that sounds kind of uh, out there, but I really think we should double down because we still have people in our organizations who represent ethnic from ethnic groups. We still have issues of people in our organizations who are part of the community that are having challenges with their abilities, mental as well as physical abilities. And so I think a lot of times the media has been able to capture this term of DIA or woke in such a way. They've been able to weaponize it in such a way. And I know recently with the election and all the executive orders that are going on, which are not laws. So I feel that until there's actually some law that has been passed, these are just executive orders, then we should just continue to do what we're doing. We still need to foster inclusion. We still need to foster a sense of belonging for all of our individuals, those who work in the library as well as working at university. And we still need to be about providing these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, which is really for everyone. So I don't think universities can really look away. I know some universities have been challenged by pressure from the administration because of the federal funding, but I think we have a good model that has been recently have come out with Harvard University. Um, I know Jerome is going to talk a little bit about that later, but I think we have a good model, and I really think that we should follow suit with that. In terms of academic libraries, I think librarians in general are very opinionated in a great way. They don't mind expressing how they feel, and I think that we should continue to do that. And if you have the opportunity, put yourself on a committee within the leadership, because once you have you're in the rooms with deans and provosts and chancellors, you'll have their ear and you can speak out about it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And since you mentioned him, maybe we'll hop over to Dr. Jerome Offer to share his thoughts as well.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll start off what I think some of the challenges are and what the work is going to be, and then I can share a glimmer of Harvard, though I don't fully represent Harvard's voice in this matter for legal purposes. I think one of our challenges around diversity, equity, and inclusion, my personal opinion is we talk about it being for a business case and diversifying staff and all the metrics that we put into place, but I think over the years we have not realize that this is human behavior work and this is change work. And that can't happen according to a metrics. That can't happen in a day or two or a year or two, because it's about learning and rethinking models of living and human beings and interaction. So I say all that to say is that whatever the acronym is, the work is not going away. And in libraries, academic, public, whatever, and LIS programs, we're still going to talk about how do you serve the community that you are hired to serve. And if you look at that community, whoever those users are, they're going to be diverse perspectives in materials. And so how do we educate ourselves to look at our bias to ensure that we're collecting and buying and producing information that fits the needs of our users? And from that foundation, I believe we're going to have to always do diversity work. So, which I know is very hard because DEI, and I'm using the acronyms based on as Dr. Chancellor said, the current administration and media kind of snatching the letters and making them a negative thing. Um, and that's just a part of reality. I think the reality is that we're now seeing, the good thing about the administration is we're seeing what people feel and how they've actually felt about this work. And it means that we have more work to do. From the Harvard perspective, I will share that I have been walking on eggshells since January 20th, like most people when the executive order came out, wondering what the guidance was going to be, wondering when it was going to come to Harvard, watching Columbia and all the other institutions. And so I have to say the proudest moment I had as a Harvard employee is when President Garber emailed the letter saying we're staying the course and we're not bending the knee. And the amount of community inspiration on campus as well as nationally and globally, I think is wonderful. We know that that just makes us a bigger target. And so there's lots of things we're discussing internally around this work, but the work is not going to go away. Belonging is still a very much issue for all of our organizations. Creating community is an issue. And if you're going to create and build teams, you got to have space for differences of perspectives, differences of work, differences of how we navigate the world together.
Thank you. That was a great response. And I'll just turn to Dr. Burns if you'd like to share your thoughts as well.
Yeah, and also thank you for having me here too. I think, like any strategic response, it's important to recognize with these policies and at some states, actual laws, that there are really like two different things that are happening here. One, there's like an attack and outlawing of DEI policies and programs under the claim that DEI is discriminatory, you know, as you mentioned earlier. And then there's the argument that people should be judged or hired or promoted, accepted into various programs based on merit. We know that from decades of research that systems of injustice and distributions of capital and property have benefited certain races and genders to the detriment of others. So there's been this like zero-sum game that's been falsely created or artificially created. And their argument about the importance of so-called merit is logically unsound based on that own fact, that people have been rewarded because of the color of the skin or their gender identity or the wealth that they've received upon birth, generational or otherwise. So I think it's important to distinguish that between what's happening with respect to what's going on at the federal level, that there's also an attack on people of color, on gender identity, and on sexual orientation. So any kind of strategic response to this has to distinguish between these two different things, like the policy stuff, but then also the attack on the peoples. So for example, by removing historical works on the Holocaust, autobiographies and memoirs like Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Cage Bird Sings, these from libraries, these anti-DE policies and actions have become more about erasure of people and their stories. And as I understand it, the new administration is using artificial intelligence to automate some of these changes. And that kind of like to remove, for example, Black and Indigenous historical figures from Pentagon related websites like the Arlington Cemetery website. And that's really kind of like clarifying because it reveals their presumption or reveals like what they're asking AI to do, which is anything to automate anything that's non-white and etc. from these websites. So this is a clear attack, not just on DEI, but also on the diverse kinds of peoples we have in this country. And so with respect to what libraries can do, like Dr. Offord and Dr. Chancellor said, we're about access, providing access to knowledge, recognizing that there are multiple perspectives on knowledge. No knowledge domain is supreme. These are all important components of the library work. And whether it's like Dr. Offord said, or whether it's DEI or another acronym, it's still the same core work that we've been doing, at least ideally for decades.
Right, right, absolutely. And in fact, kind of building off that idea that, maybe the acronym has to change, but the work continues. I had read in a recent article for Bloomberg Law, which I'll share in the chat as well, two NYU law professors, Kenji Yoshino and David Glasgow, note that nowhere in the actual executive orders pertaining to DEI and higher ed does the administration actually define what DEI means to them or list any specific activities that it would consider illegal. So could this ambiguity in a way allow maybe institutions to restructure the scope or language of existing policies, DEI policies, in order to avoid being targeted? And maybe as a follow-up question, does this ambiguity or this moment in time also invite an opportunity to maybe reframe or reconsider the existing DEI frameworks that we have in place? And so let's see, who should I start with? Maybe I'll call on Dr. Offord this time to start, just to change things.
All right, can you all hear me good now? I'm sorry, I got a note to pull closer. So the law professors are absolutely right, which is one of the things around the majority of the executive orders. They're not law. And one of the guidance was supposed to come out 120 days, I think, and that was Sunday technically. And so there's no guidance. So at this point, the executive order is rhetoric and it's not a definition. So even in defining DEI and some of the anti-DEI movement stuff that's happening, if you look at any of the letters, the demand letters sent to colleges and universities, you can see that the very things that they're asking institutions to do is discriminatory. And so it's kind of this bait and switch between the letter and the executive order and the information is going out, but we have not heard definitively from any branch of the government or any particular agency of the government to define what they perceive or how they define DEI, which is also part of the trick as far as trying to implement and change anything. And Dr. Burns did mention that it's a little trickier for folks in states where the state legislature has done so, has defined it, or said what you can't do. And every state has done it very differently. So there's not one singular approach to dismantling this work, which again adds to some of the chaos. But we don't have anything federally to tell us what DEI is. And it's all pointing back to, and I'm just going to use an emotionally charged word from the Trump administration, others, a lot of white fragility around the erasure, as Dr. Burns said, of histories and people and activities. But it also reminds us of colonization very easily. And so it's a scary time, but we don't have a definition. So at this point, as the young folks say, we're getting a lot of gaslighting from Washington about this topic. So yeah, interesting times ahead of us.
Right, thank you. So maybe I'll turn to Dr. Chancellor. Would you like to respond as well?
Yes, I mean, it's, I agree that the authors of that article is true. It does create an opportunity because there is so much going on right now. It does create a opportunity, and specifically for the profession. I'm just going to kind of take a little page back as history is my thing. This profession, excuse me, have historically, I can recall when we spent so many years, meaning the library profession, spent so many years trying to define what diversity was.
Mhm.
There were so many articles written about what is diversity? Is diversity divergent? What is this, right? So I actually think that hurt us in a way because we spent so much time trying to figure out or to define what diversity was rather than just know that it exists, right? It is really the differences that exist among us. And I think similarly, they don't know what diversity is because they just don't like the acronym. They don't like what it represents. And I think most of the time, most of it is really targeted towards Black and Brown people because they think that that's really what diversity is. When in reality, it's more than that. It's more, like I kind of mentioned before, it's like those who are not able-bodied, it refers to them. Those who are the reason why we have these policies, and I think, thank you, Dr. Burns, for bringing up that point. The reason why we have these policies at universities and at corporations is because of equity. A policy is the movement um, from I'm sorry, I'm having a little brain freeze here. A movement towards parental leave rather than maternity leave, right? That is a DIA policy. A policy, DIA policy is having ergonomics, chairs in the workplace, right? Or in our cars that we drive, right? Those are DIA policies. And I think those who are opposed to it or those who are not well informed don't really understand what the definition is. And so it does kind of denigrates it to like I said, they're able to weaponize it in ways that the populace doesn't really understand. And so, yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
And I just add briefly again, I think part of what we have to also realize is the policies that are in place that have been in place that are now being labeled as DEI were created from traumatic experience of one part of our community. And so we have the ADA, we have the exception clause for students with disabilities or students who may need other supports. All this stuff, all these policies were created because there was harm based on giving everyone the same thing equally. And sometimes equity and equality are not the same thing.
And Dr. Burns, would you like to share as well?
Yeah, the article, the Bloomberg Law article, I thought was really interesting. And one of the things I wanted to highlight about that article was the distinction the authors made between lifting DI and leveling DI. And they argued that like lifting DI is what is targeted by these anti-DEI measures. And they state that the difference between lifting and leveling DI gives basically an overt preference to underrepresented groups and, for example, some selection process. And leveling DI attempts to remove the biases that we might bring with us when we try to evaluate based on what we think is merit however that's defined too, because this is often also proposed as the ideal value by this administration, but also is ill-defined and is usually proposed by people who come from extreme privilege too. So on the surface, what the authors kind of argue is seems kind of rational and solid. So um, like if I can just read an excerpt. So the authors write, the difference between illegal DEI and illegal DEI and legal DEI could be styled as the difference between what we call lifting DEI and leveling DEI. The contrast can be seen through an example. So like in 1970, they write, less than 5% of musicians in the top symphony orchestras were women. We could solve such a problem in one of two ways. Lifting DEI would give a bump or preference to women in the audition process, and leveling DI would de-bias the audition process by removing gender from the equation altogether. In fact, the orchestra directors chose the leveling strategy and had everyone audition behind a screen, arguably leading to a dramatic increase in the number of women musicians. So on the surface, this seems like very fair and just way of removing bias. But I think the authors failed to take into question some kind of background issues, like who has access to years of music lessons, as well as the cost of instruments to prepare for a future where they're qualified to even get into the audition room, and who has access to safe environments, stable nutritious food, stable income, a roof over their heads, or the time, because parents can be overworked, for them to get the kind of music education hours of daily practice they would need to, again, get them in the audition room in the first place. So it's an interesting distinction that the authors make between leveling and lifting DI, but we can't, I think it's also a distraction. And there has to be some kind of good response is going to have to combine both. There is going to be it is going to be necessary to lift, like for example, the examples with respect to ADA and ergonomic chairs. And these are things that don't remove bias, but lift us in some cases, literally, like with the chairs. Dr. Chancellor saw where I was going with that. But yeah, so that's the point I want to make. It's going to involve a broad spectrum of strategies, and we can't just focus on distractions. I think which is the authors make a really interesting case, but kind of distracting too.
So if I can offer just something really quick about the same study. So again, the example of equality and equity, when they started to do the blind reviews for the orchestra seats to increase women's participation, they found that women were not being selected at the same rate the first round. And what the reason was, women, you can determine who the women were because they had on heels and they were walking across the wood floor. So the panelists, even though it was supposed to be a blind panel, used bias information to still do the selecting. So what did they do? They started telling women to take your heels off or wear flats that didn't make sound. And that's how they finally got to a place where they were able to do full blind reviews for the orchestra.
Great points, all of you. Thank you so much. And I think also that discussion of equity versus equality transitions well to the next question, which is specifically focusing on affirmative action, which was the original entry point for developing this webinar. And then along came the executive orders, and it changed a little bit. But so even before the executive orders were issued, the ones targeting DEI, we were all aware of the 2023 Supreme Court decision, which upended affirmative action in higher education admissions. And then that had already caused a lot of worry about the downstream effects that would, potentially worsen access to higher education, which already has its own, hurdles of inequity and all of that. So how do these executive orders further complicate the situation, and maybe how can we strategize around this given the kind of compounding difficulties? And maybe I'll call on Dr. Burns first, if that's okay, just to change the order, unless someone else wants to go first. Okay.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think both my colleagues here have said that we have to maintain DEI, that DEI is the work. This is not just DEI, relatively speaking, may be kind of a newish term, but it's not a fad, and it's still always the work. So libraries have always been ideally have been imperfectly so sometimes throughout history, but have ideally been about providing access to information, resources, books, etc. And we still have to like make sure that we focus on the fundamentals, um, our core values, for example. Uh, and this is like a really overused example. Like when libraries are not involved in the admissions process at universities. Libraries do hire though, right? One of the things I would like to see is librarians involved more in education programs, library science programs, for example. With that respect, I mean, that's difficult because there are institutional barriers in place for people to just jump into their local library science program if they have one and get involved. However, there are associations like the one Elise that you mentioned earlier that I'm president-elect of, that needs more involvement from practitioners and others out in the field who can contribute to the discussions about library education, who is getting educated, who is attending library science programs, and so on and so forth. And so I think by continuing to have those discussions and doing the work to diversify our own profession and all the ways that it can be diversified to reflect, the composition of our country, would be helpful in this.
Great, great points. And maybe next I'll call on Dr. Offord.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'll start from the bottom of the question up. I think the executive order is going to give people who have not done well or have not been committed to recruiting diverse populations or in diversity, a flag to say, see, we don't have to do it anymore. And unfortunately, that's going to be the out. And I just want to say too, I don't believe that our profession is homogeneous. We don't have everybody in the profession doesn't believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so we have to be real and honest about that. The Supreme Court case around admissions, which Harvard was one of the litigants for, really showed that the dismantling of this, or the belief that people of color, or some people of color, specifically Black folks and Latinos, are only accepted at some of these institutions because of the color of their skin, and that we don't have the intellectual aptitude to be accepted, or we're not higher on the food chain of intellectual stability abilities. And so therefore we're taking up space from others. And one of the hardest articles was to see when MIT put out their numbers. Someone wrote an article and said, see, I told you they were just getting in because they were Black and brown. And what folks didn't realize is that maybe students decided not to come to those institutions because of what was happening with DEI. And so they are going back to minority serving institutions. And so being in a place where they feel comfortable, knowing that DEI and some of the conversations and what's happening in the media may have an impact on them as an individual. And so, how do you navigate these issues based on one particular set of populations who want to dismantle this work, and not understanding that the generation who is now coming to college have grown up with DEI, understands DEI, has experienced it more than some of our boomers and the older Gen Xers, that those of us that are in that generation too. So they have a totally different experience. And so there's this huge gap between what people believe is happening and what the younger generation understands is happening. And I think we're going to see at some point the younger generation saying, we are going to fight for this. And we've seen it on our campus that is people are fighting for. The students want this. And so we really want to have an institution that models the nation, and we have to consider having a diverse group of students to help prepare for the future generations.
Right, great point. And yeah, Dr. Chancellor, please, your thoughts as well.
I'll just add on to that. So there is such overwhelming data when at institutions where there is from students, where there are a diverse students in the classroom, that students overwhelmingly benefit from everyone. So it's going to be something that each institution is going to have to reconcile with. Um, do they really believe in diversity, or are we and inclusion, or do we just want to go stick with what we can leverage what's going on in the country right now in terms of the executive orders. I remember a time where I used to go into a college website and you see one African American, one Asian American, one member from the Latinx community. You have one, right? And it's like checking a box. And that always got under my skin because I always realized that it's not just like checking the box. And I'm fearful that we're going to even go beyond that, right? We don't have to consider people from other groups. One of the things that we are doing, one of the things that I was told that can be done, I'm not speaking for Syracuse University, but one of the things that I can be done is like when you're recruiting these students, rather than specifically targeting specific communities per se, you can target like zip codes. You can you can recruit from zip codes. You can have presence at zip codes. You can, go to, especially for graduate programs, you can go to HBCUs. There are certain things that can be done that is not in violation, so to speak, of, the affirmative action law that was passed in 2023 that can be, if you're still focusing on, if you want to be inclusive. The same thing, similar with recruitment of faculty and staff as well. So those efforts need to be made as well. And
Yeah, great points, truly all the way around. Thank you all for your insights. Now just turning to focus more on like the library profession and maybe information profession, among colleagues. There is clearly like a difference between, what universities are experiencing. Some are under more threat than others at this moment in time. So with that in mind, like how might academic librarians or information scholars at private institutions that are less affected or unaffected maybe support their colleagues at public institutions that are under greater threat from these executive orders? And is there maybe like, are there any sets of collective actions that can be employed across the sector, or just in general, what might be helpful, as sort of like cross-sector solidarity? Oh, and who should start? Who should I call on first, maybe? Let's see, maybe Dr. Chancellor, yeah.
okay, I'm glad you asked this question because recently I've been in communication with other DIA deans at other I schools for us to come together to try to not only just commiserate, but maybe to build some tools that we could use. I've also been involved in leadership across the nation, whereby I've met with other deans of DIA, of those who do diversity work, um, in a program called ACC-ALN. It's like an academic leadership network. And we built a toolkit of what's going on at each individual campus to kind of like come together with the collective resource of how to address certain issues. Like you said, it's very hard to get your head around because institutions are at different places, right? And then institutions have different leadership and they have different beliefs about how they should proceed. But I do think coming together is really the first start of trying to kind of get our arms around this issue.
Please, Dr. Offord, go ahead.
Yeah, so Dr. Chancellor mentioned, I think sometimes that we think in a silo as librarians and in libraries. I think we really need to plug into the greater communities. I know Dr. Chancellor has probably been involved, I'm not sure about Dr. Burns, but the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education was the first group, one of the first organizations to sign on to a brief to sue the Trump administration around its DEI policies. And so being with that group, who are mostly CDOs, chief diversity officers from institutions, but they also have academic diversity officers like myself. But so it was 1,200 of us who just met in Chicago. And so, yes, it was great to be in community as far as understanding, commiserating kind of what's happening, but also the inspiration and the charge of energy that you get from that community. So I think we need to plug into other organizations outside of the libraries, outside of the library world, to see how the institution as a whole is grappling with this topic. We need to find ways to support ALA, ALICE, and other organizations who are standing up and holding up the banner of fighting anti-DEI. But I also think it would be helpful, and this is probably one activity that I loved and learned in my PhD program. A lot of it was traumatic, but this is something I've always enjoyed: is scenario planning. We should get together and think about what are four scenarios. Let's just say, what happens if the Supreme Court supports the removal of DEI from everything in the US? What happens to libraries? What happens to higher education? What happens to corporate America? And I know we could just talk about the libraries, but so many of our families that work in libraries have family in other spaces and children. What are some of the things that we can start thinking about now to support either way this issue go? And we have conversations about those now. When it happens, I don't feel like we would feel like we're behind the curveball. We knew President Trump was going to do this. He promised it on his campaign, so we kind of knew about this. And I was amazed that so many people were shocked that it actually happened. I was like, well, he said he was going to do it. He was very clear about it, but we didn't know preparations. And even on campus, I asked the question before winter break. And I was like, what are we going to do if on January 20th he signs an executive order to ban DEI? And folks were like, well, I don't think that's going to happen. It's too early. And then when it happened, everybody looked at me and was like, oh my God, how did you know that? And I was like, if you pay attention. So part of it is that we have to also pay attention to the landscape. And I know it's overwhelming. I had to turn off media because of my blood pressure was skyrocketing, but we have to find a way to stay plugged in. And my response to that was I read all the executive orders and I took notes. So knowing the deadlines, knowing the outcome, knowing who's engaged, and just paying attention to the moves will help us be able to do that. So being able to do that in a collective aspect to keep each other away from as much as possible the emotional parts of this and look at the strategy that'll help us really as a community to be prepared to deal with whatever comes next from the Trump administration.
Right, great point. And I guess Dr. Burns, if you'd like to share as well.
Yeah, sure. I just want to triple down on what my colleagues have just stated. I had in my notes, for example, to develop networks, and that's, I think both Doctors Chancellor and Offord have emphasized that like really well. And then with respect to Dr. Chancellor's speaking about toolkits, I mean, we already, and Dr. Offord just mentioned, we knew what was coming because they had given us a roadmap with their Project 2025 book, and we need to also, just to back that up, we need also those toolkits, those frameworks, those roadmaps to stay the course and to combat what's happening out there. And so with respect to that, we share organizational knowledge, what works at Dr. Offord's institution that could help, some other institution, or one of our listeners' institutions that could help at other institutions, what doesn't work. So even though there's a lot of differences that are happening between states, still there are things that we can learn from each other. And this is part of being in a profession, is sharing that kind of organizational knowledge. And then also sharing case studies, like what could happen if the Supreme Court rules against DEI, like Dr. Offord just pointed out. So I think I love that we're all in like perfect, I think, consensus here. And but it's really important as a profession to develop those networks so that we can act collectively, to have frameworks and roadmaps so that we can respond, not just over the next 2, 3, 4 months, but over the next 10, 15, 20 years too.
And I also lift up all the work that I think it's the Big Tens are doing, the faculty are voting to how to actually formalize this work together, how they're going to come together and build this compact, they're going to defend each other. So how do we do that as libraries and library systems? And I know that we are subunits as a part of the institution, but we have to find ways, those of us who can lead the way. And I'm again glad that Harvard is doing it, even though it's a painstaking process. But how do institutions support bravery and folks being brave to step out and say, we're going to push this envelope. So how do we do that? And I'll say my commitment is, I'm happy to talk to anybody. We can have coffee, tea over Zoom. That's my contribution. I love connecting with people one-on-one or in groups. So if you feel silent on campus, you just want to talk to somebody, shoot me an email. I'm happy to jump on a Zoom. But I think we have to find ways to keep each other encouraged. And I'm just going to say in the fight, this is a critical time for us to really depend on one another.
Right. So well said, all of you, and very inspiring answers as well. I think it makes me feel more optimistic at least. I think now is also a good time to maybe transition to the Q&A. We have a number in the chat, so I'll just start going through them. And please, to our attendees, you're welcome to continue asking in the Q&A as well. So the first one is more of a comment from Alicia Pearson. Just want to say thank you, Harvard. So it's appreciated, like what you said, Jerome, earlier, that it's being acknowledged, I think, very clear. Okay, next question. What do you think about rebranding libraries as neutral and promoting reference services as a means to help users in objective ways to navigate the information landscape in neutral ways from varied perspectives that avoid terminology that has been unfortunately politicized, especially in geographic regions most at risk for misinformation? Can libraries save the world, in short, I guess?
I'll jump in and say, yes, I think we do play a critical role in saving the world. I think one of the things we have to navigate is, are we truly neutral? Are libraries really neutral? And once we understand what that means, I mean, there's historical aspects of the answer to that is no. In some communities, the answer is no. Some communities, it's yes. And so even as we think about library and library services, we have to really determine what the term neutral means and what we're not going to blend so much of that it doesn't feel like we are actually leading in this area.
Can I just jump in? I would agree. I mean, and this has been the century-old debate about are libraries neutral? I'm going to be honest, put myself out there. Libraries have never been neutral. I don't think they actually can be neutral, especially in this time, right? So libraries have taken a stand on issues that they historically that they want to take a stand on. I think reverting back to a neutral position, or at least saying that they're going to reclaim this neutrality, doesn't really help. So that's where I stand with that.
I'll just add that access as a core principle is not a neutral stance. And I still think about, it's on the ALA's website, but Lester Asheim's article, not censorship, but selection. And I wrote down selection begins with a presumption in favor of liberty of thought, censorship with a presumption in favor of thought control. And if we're about selection and are about providing access, selection is not neutral. It is in favor of a democratic ideal and not against, and it's in disfavor of an authoritarian state. And those are not neutral. And we don't, I think, as Dr. Chancellor just kind of alluded to, we're not always and haven't been perfect about that historically, very far from the case, but it's something that we need to continue to work for. And what I do practically, that means, I think, a good collection development policy. I mean, just a hands down good, well justified collection development policy. And I'm surprised often by how many libraries don't have one, and also digital libraries don't have one. And a good, justifiable, well defended, rational collection development policy based on our core principles can do a lot for clarifying how we're not neutral, but provide access and serve our communities in important ways.
And I'll add to this. I think the other piece that we have to also think about the broader information ecosystem is that vendors are not neutral. They are not neutral in their publishing. They're not neutral in who they target. And so how do we even decide, Dr. Burns, great example of what, if we have a collection development policy, whatever the policy is and the process and all of that, how do we hold the vendor community accountable as well? Sometimes, with the buying plans or approval plans, people just go with what the vendor recommends. And so is the vendor finding a way to support diversity, equity, and inclusion broader, or even double down in this time of uh, democracy crisis, as I call it?
Yeah, great points. And in fact, there's a couple comments in the Q&A agreeing. Gabrielle said, wait, I lost the comment. Just want to add that libraries have never been neutral. So yeah, nice to be, corroborated. And then also Karen says neutrality can be a way of making historically marginalized groups of people invisible, which is part of the harms that have been done to those groups in the past. And also kind of piggybacking on what Dr. Burns said earlier about like erasing certain histories. Yeah, great answers, everybody. This one, more of a comment from Adriana. Thank you for your insights, especially for highlighting the ongoing efforts to erase our stories. When it comes to government data, libraries are playing a crucial role in archiving, but it's equally important for institutions and communities to preserve this work. We can't erase our history and we can't go back. Please encourage libraries and institutions to archive so that institutions are held accountable and have no choice but to move forward. Yeah, great point. Please, if you want to comment on it.
Yeah, I think, well, and I'll say this as a person who clearly is African American, male, that I think most of us in minoritized communities are accustomed to the erasure. This is something that we've lived our whole life and seen and fighting the erasure. And so, how do we do that now is becoming more critical because it's across the board. The target is all of us and what's being erased. And so, again, I hope this gives us an opportunity to sit and think around how this and develop those case studies and say, what if this happens again? Because history repeats itself, right? So, how do we prepare the next generation of librarians and information professionals 50 years from now to say, hey, this is what happened in 2025, and oh my God, were we blindsided by it? But here's some things that you can do to prevent this from happening again in the future.
Right. Okay, another question from Daniel says, do you see the executive orders affecting student enrollment, or has it already, just based on what you've observed?
Yes. And particularly international students.
Mm,
Executive order has really impacted, international students. So yes, absolutely.
And I would add that the executive orders, if again, having going to read them, one of the pushes as they dismantle the Department of Education and defunding a lot of the higher education pieces is they're funding and moving the target to be towards trades. And while I support tradespersons and we know they play a critical role and there's a shortage, they're moving away from the college educated, which is going to impact the professorate at some point. It's going to impact, folks who want to do research and scientists. And so we have to really look at what the attack is really the foundation of the why. They want to decrease the intellectual hub and spend more time and energy in increasing trade or trade-like positions across education across the country. So even in looking at that, it's really a kind of a darn if you do, darn if you don't, because who's going to teach the tradespersons if they don't have the education to do it? But we're increasing trade training and education, and so it's just kind of who's at the wheel is the issue. It's like how people who don't have any kind of educational background trying to guide
mm,
education.
mhm,
Can I just add to that? I also think that is an effort to kind of de-educate the populace, right?
mm,
So when you do that, then you're able to have your agenda through, right? Get your agenda through, right? That's how you're able to, you know, have mis and disinformation prevail. And I think that's part of the problem. Not, I mean, and when you think of what they're trying to do in terms of just like putting these requirements on or these strict policies on institutions, terminating grants that can help fund research in for libraries and also just in general in the information space. I think that is really what their target is, in addition to just moving to trade, but it's also just in general, just to kind of like de-educate or have a populace that's not as educated so that they can critically assess these issues on their own.
Yes, and in combination with that, also creating a certain kind of fear about higher education. There are already international students, students of color, students of various sexual orientations and gender identities who are already feeling isolated on campus because of the current stuff. And this will also, I think, work to dampen enrollment with or without an explicit um, executive order focused on student enrollment. So one of the other things I want to add to this is that there's been a number of reports about the decline of just reading fiction and things like that. And I think the library profession often gets a little bit teased about its focus historically on books now that we're in the so-called information age. But like last year, I went down to the student cafeteria, where the like campus cafeteria, where people, and I saw in a room of like probably 800 students, is a big cafeteria, like one young student reading an actual print book, and it was just very weird. It was kind of like, whoa, this is what's going on here. And but reading like fosters not just an education, like Dr. Chancellor would say, but it fosters empathy, it combats cynicism. And so I think we have to be unashamed about promoting reading, even in the academic setting, things like fiction. I know that's often like, oh, that's a public library thing, but it's not. It's an educator thing, that's an academic library thing, it's all these things. And reading is fundamentally important. And we need to, I think, try to build back a reading culture. Thanks.
So another question that came through from Jenny, this webinar is such a breath of fresh air. Thank you all for your expertise and your dedication. My question, my library serves a majority minority population as well as having a diverse staff. We are DEI just by existing. What are some extra things we can do to make the library feel safe and provide support to our students? For whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll jump in. I think one thing that could be done is, I'm not sure what type of programs that are offered, but to bring speakers in to talk about some of these issues that are just going on in existing issues in the country, but also just general issues. I feel that there is so much anxiety that is out there. So even though you have DIA in the library, you also need to understand like what others are going through. So maybe some social events would help as well, just to kind of take the tension off. And like I said, like just I think hopefully the leadership is being a little bit understanding. I actually kind of somewhat compare this situation that we're in to like COVID, right? When COVID hit, people were stressed, they were concerned about their health. And so they required, the charge from administrators were to have, just to be a little bit lax on students, be a little bit understanding, a little bit, give them a little bit of, time because everyone's going through it. I think we're at that moment. This is not just this is just not a moment in time. Actually, when you think about it, historically, we've been dealing with these issues of race for over 400 years. So this is really nothing new. But we are not getting the attacks of executive orders and things like that. But I do think having your leader, hopefully, if the leader is understanding, just give people a little bit of time. I've incorporated that into my lectures during this period of time for students. I've been a little bit more lax on them turning in their assignments and things like that. So hopefully something like that can happen in the library.
I needed Professor Chancellor when I was in school. I go to the basics. For me, there's two things that always help build community. Food, as we know, always provides an opportunity. And whenever I lead a session or facilitate with large groups, The second thing is music. People use music as an expression or books. And so one of my favorite icebreakers when I start is I tell people, give to everyone to list one song that's kind of their inspirational song, and then one song that's kind of like their hype song. That one song that just gets them charged up. They're getting ready to be, the baddest person in the crew, whatever it is. And so we create playlists, and people listen to other people's perspective through music. And it's a wonderful way for folks to say, "Oh my God, I love that song. Oh, I never heard that song. I didn't know about this artist." But really finding ways to include and engage people, and there's groups out there. I love the whole issue around literacy. Black boys have the lowest literacy rate in the country, and so there's organizations like Fathers That Read, and it started by a Black father who said Black children need to see Black dads reading to them. And so reaching out to some of those community groups, as Dr. Chancellor said, some of those speakers, but also providing space for folks to vent. And so just being able to say, let's just sit and chat. What are you experiencing? What's going on? And one of the things I'll share that we have that's happening in one of the small towns outside of Boston is the children are worried to go to school because they're afraid that ICE is going to come take their friends. And that, I mean, just imagine being in second and third grade with that type of pressure. So we're going to need conversations and need help. And sometimes we may need to bring in the mental health specialists to really help all of us navigate these spaces, because we all react and respond differently to cortisol buildup and stress.
Mhm, mhm, mhm. Dr. Chancellor, somebody mentioned in the Q&A the ACC-ALN toolkit that you mentioned, wondering if it can be accessed from people outside of the organization. They're saying it sounds exactly like the kind of guidance I've been hoping to find.
Unfortunately, at this point, it's not available outside of the organization. So,
Okay. Well,
but I'm happy to, meet with you or chat with you about some things that are available on there that maybe you could do for, your organization.
okay. Um, There's also another question for Dr. Burns regarding the having a good collection development policy, and if anyone else wants to add on as well. What structure should a good collection development policy have, and how do we speak to decision makers to move them toward these?
That's a great question. So a collection development policy should have at least a selection policy and a deselection policy. And then it should also cover various genres and formats. It shouldn't cover specifically, like many collection development policies are still written as if we're just in the print era, but electronic resources are really important, if not a major part now, of academic libraries. And so that needs to also be incorporated into a collection development policy. And part of that is because electronic resources, we sometimes act as if they're print resources in the way we treat them, or the way we search for them, or the way we access them. But in many ways, they're entirely unlike print resources. They're almost more like software in many cases. And so that just creates a whole other set of issues. For example, accessibility. Can I access an electronic resource via a screen reader? How usable is the electronic resource? What's the copyright policy on the electronic resource? What kind of devices can I access it? Can I access the resources on? So all those kinds of things can be part when you get into into the weeds on a CDP, collection development policy. All those kind of things should be addressed or taken into consideration in some way. Overall, though, to go back to Lester Asheim's essay on selection and not censorship, the selection policy should really focus on the worth of a resource or a source of information, and not look for things to get rid of it. Like when we start focusing on the negative aspects of a resource instead of focusing on its overall value, what it brings and adds to the collection, then that's when we begin to censor stuff. So look for things, and the selection part of the process should look for things, for reasons to keep instead of looking for reasons to discard. And then a deselection part of that, some things do get outdated or or just aren't adding to the collection in some way that's relevant to the community. And so, and that could be a medical community, that could be an English program, Spanish language program, library science program, chemistry program, etc. And then, maybe some things need to be removed in order, because the other problem with electronic resources is that we don't buy them anymore. We don't buy the resources, we lease them pretty much. And so that makes deselection almost carry more weight, because we don't necessarily have a library or an offsite storage place to hold the material indefinitely, to archive them, as somebody asked about earlier. So it becomes really important to weigh how electronic resources are factored into a CDP policy. I hope that answers the question.
And I would add really quickly, I know we're at time, is that we have to also think about this as we talk about building our archival collections and what we will accept as donations, what we don't. Or if we do accept something that's considered to be controversial, then we tell the community the why. The last example I'll use is we had a question around the digitization of a donation at Harvard Law School, and what they found in some of the notebooks from the donor was some very racist comments about Black people. And so they said, well, maybe we shouldn't digitize this and make it publicly. I was like, just say a statement that this is not something that Harvard Law endorses. This was a time period where people thought this was okay, but this is also a documentation to show the history of our country. And so being able to talk about some of the controversial pieces and honor it and give people the information up front also helps us.
Yeah, great point. Both great answers. And we have so many more questions, but I don't think we'll get time to answer the rest. So I guess this is a good place to wrap it up. I'll hand it back over to Sabrina to close us out. But thank you everyone for coming. And I'm sorry to the questions we couldn't get to, but they're all great. Thank you so much for dropping them in the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Fatima. I'll just echo you and say thanks so much to Renata, Sean, and Jerome for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you to our attendees for your engagement with your questions and your comments. I'd like to remind our viewers that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice and Ty with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you found this session informative and helpful, and we hope to see you again soon on another webinar.